was on September 3rd at our rally.
Oh, there you go.
Now that would have been thousands of views right there.
We talk millions.
Yeah.
On our Facebook Live, we talk millions.
Yeah.
Wow,
Millions of views.
it was beautiful.
Our
Just
press
Pam
conference
and
in Philly, I think, is up towards 2 million right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's amazing.
It's
The
insane. People are
just
very
eating it up.
excited. I mean, I just asked people to give me information on the Recount the other night,
Yeah.
and we reached almost 1 million people.
Yeah.
I said, I'm in Detroit. Can anyone here give me information? And it just went crazy. So I just said, okay, I see the future. Let me just at least get this so I can do old-fashioned recording of voice. But anyway, so what's Trump afraid of?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That is the question.
Now, seriously, what do you think? What were you finding? Were you really heading towards getting numbers that would overturn this election?
We don't know. I mean, and this began from Trump even before there were any numbers whatsoever. He was just trying to stop it. But Michigan was kind of a worrisome situation for him because he had a margin of 10,000 and there were 75,000 votes that were blank, many of which were in communities of color that are historically Democratic. So obviously this was a concern for him, and they were throwing up legal challenges everywhere he went. So yeah, he seemed like he was running scared. Either that he doesn't believe in democracy, and there's plenty of indication of that, and or that he just doesn't have confidence in his vote.
Well, 75,000 votes for president were blank or invalidated. So is it just maybe people just didn't want to vote, they waited in line, didn't want to vote for president?
Yeah, exactly, right. People waited in line in order not to vote. They cared about everything, but president didn't matter.
By the way, can we introduce yourself since some of this is live too?
Yes, my name is Anita Bell. Yes, so
And how are you related to Jill besides wearing a green sweater?
Oh, well, I'm a member of the Michigan Green Party, and also a president of the Reparations Labor Union, and we had endorsed the Green Party because of the Green Party having its official stance as being in favor of reparations. And then I also was a supervisor in Wayne County with the Recount, and so that's how I'm related to this.
Yeah, okay, and maybe, in fact, I'd like both of you to kind of answer this, but first, Jill.
Okay.
Why do you call it a Jim Crow election?
Well, it's a Jim Crow election system because it fails preferentially in communities of color, and whether it's because of the chaos in some polling centers are closed and then some are moved, and there's all kinds of mix-ups. So a lot of people are filling out provisional ballots in the first place, or they were being tossed off the voter rolls by interstate cross-check, and they filled out a provisional ballot, which is what you do when the election official can't find your name on the voter rolls. Then you fill out a so-called provisional ballot, which is like a little minefield, and it's got all these little booby traps in it that prevent your vote from getting counted. Like if you have written in cursive instead of writing, in print, your provisional ballot can be invalidated. Or if certain information goes below the line, I understand it can be invalidated. So whether you have these voting machines or not, there are just problems that are tending to occur in under-resourced communities, and so that applies also to the voting machines. And what we saw happen in Detroit was 87 of the optical scanners failed in Detroit. Why did they fail? Because they were old, they weren't working very well. Now that's just the ones that failed. There may be others that didn't quite read right. That's the thing with the scanners. They have to be carefully maintained and programmed. Calibrated, the word is. Yes, thank you. Because if they're not...
That's bad. I'm not supposed to be telling you how to answer the question. Go ahead.
If they're not properly calibrated, they will think that something is unvoted for. They will read it as blank when it's not actually blank. So there may be a very logical explanation for this sudden high skyrocketing of the blank votes in Michigan. Michigan's never had this many blank votes before.
Well, I do notice that the Detroit, I mean, Donald Trump has said, Democrats have failed you, speaking to African Americans in the inner cities. They've run these cities into the ground. Now you actually have the Republican governor who has taken over in Flint and Detroit. And so do you see that in Flint and Detroit that maybe that some of the problems may have to do with what's called emergency management, or the kind of takeover, the occupation by the Republican Party of Detroit and Flint? Is this part of the issue? And then I'd like to ask Anita to answer that too. By the way, since we are live, this is Greg Palast reporting. I'm here with Dr. Jill Stein, presidential candidate for the Green Party, and Anita Bell of the party, who is local here in Detroit.
Let's just say that, these problems have been long-standing here. The disinvestment, the hollowing out, the extraction of wealth and labor from these communities, the movement of jobs. Look at Benton Harbor, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Benton Harbor, one of the poorest African-American communities in the country, the only one, actually, that had a magnificent piece of waterfront property that was public property, that was basically stolen by the Whirlpool Corporation, which had moved all of its jobs out of Benton Harbor. And we have a colleague who is in jail now for having challenged,
Yes.
for having challenged the theft of that property.
And who is that?
That is Reverend Edward Pinckney, who is just, a wonderful defender of democracy, and who challenged the city council. He challenged Whirlpool. He challenged the general theft of the public resources. And if I'm not mistaken, that was under Democrats. It preceded the reign of Republicans. So this is part of a long-standing tradition of assaulting poor people and people of color here in the state of Michigan, which makes the point. This is not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. This is a problem of an oligarchy that is systematically robbing the 99%, especially the 99% of color that is particularly vulnerable.
Yes. Now, what winds up happening when Donald Trump says, well, the Democrats have failed you, and so you should come to the Republican Party. When you say that to people in Detroit, after we know what the Republicans have done to us in terms of bankrupting the city of Detroit, in terms of poisoning the water over in Flint, then we don't feel, if the Democrats have failed us, my goodness, the Republicans are bankrupting us and killing us. So we have, what choice do we have between the two? That's why I went green, because I'm like, these are my choices.
Well, let me ask you, do you think if the Republican-imposed administration here knew, since the machines were deadly old, that there would be problems and votes would be lost in Detroit? Do you think that they were aware that this would happen?
Oh, yes. And what we knew would happen in Detroit, because we knew this from the 2013 election where recounts were asked for, because during that particular election, that's when a city which is 85% black suddenly voted for a white man to become mayor on a write-in ballot. And so one of the things that somebody showed Jill is that these are the write-in ballots, and so many of them had the same handwriting, and yet these were supposedly mailed in on absentee ballots by different people. All of these people had the same handwriting anyway. Long story.
You're saying, would you agree with this, that this presidential election wasn't some special target in the African American vote that just happened for the first time in 2016?
The U.S. Civil Rights Commission many years ago put out a report that the odds of your vote being miscounted, uncounted, or thrown into the trash bin are increased 900% if you are in a community of color. 900%, and that wasn't just like in this election. So this is a long-standing problem. I mean, the fight for the vote, for the African American community is really, you know, one of the epic battles of this
Yes.
country. Not only the civil rights movement, but, you know, the struggle to vote historically is a long, bitter, and bloody battle. And what we're seeing now is sort of the modern version of that battle, the systematic discounting of votes in communities of color. And it's shocking to think that the discounting of these votes may be actually making the critical difference in the outcome of the election. Whether this, I mean, in my mind, whether this is by design or whether it's by default, you know, the sense of, well, I don't care what happens in the African American community, we're just going to starve them of resources anyhow, that's not okay either. You know, so I personally, I don't care whether it's the blindness and the inhumanity of elected officials, their inherent racism, or whether it's intentional acts of electoral sabotage.
Right.
To my mind, it doesn't make any difference. The important thing is that it's happening. What we've seen even in just the couple days of this recount really underscores that this is a really serious and critical problem. Barack Obama, you know, called for a national investigation on the role of hacking in these elections, assaulting the integrity of our elections. And I would just point out that you don't have to look halfway around the world in order to find an assault on the integrity of these elections. We know that this voting system is very compromised and vulnerable. It's vulnerable not only to hacking, but to tampering, to machine error, and human error. And it's happening all up and down the technology of the vote and the systems of the vote. And it is a Jim Crow system, and it all needs to be fixed. It's not rocket science. This is just plain basic democracy. And I think the people of Detroit are so inspired and principled and passionate. They really are a model for this struggle around the nation.
Well, Donald Trump says they may be inspired, but they also, especially in communities of color, people like to vote twice and 3 times. He said the election's rigged, and this is a quote from Donald Trump, because people are voting many, many times. And I asked the Office of Secretary of State here in Michigan about whether there are massive numbers of double voters, and they said, oh yes, but we've removed them from the voter rolls by a system that they called interstate cross-check, which of course at Rolling Stone we've done a long investigation of. Do you think that could have also affected how how the vote came out, that people were removed from the voter rolls as being? Well, first of all, let me ask you. I'm going to ask you a question, Nita. Do people in the black community just vote twice?
No, it's hard enough to get to vote the first time. After you stand in line for 3 hours, you're going to say, I think I'll go have some coffee and come back and do it again. Really? No, that's not what's happening.
Well, let me show you that Mr. Chris Kobach, who's the Secretary of State of Kansas, who works with Mr. Trump, created a national list, including here in Michigan, of this is called the cross-check list, identifying people who may have registered or voted twice in the same election in 2 states. Now, here's examples from the Michigan list, which we showed the Secretary of State yesterday, of potential double voters. These are all people who voted in Georgia and Michigan. They all happen to be named Michael Brown, and here's the list.
There's a lot of Michael Browns, but here's my problem. Michael Brown is a very common name.
Well, not common for Republicans, as I understand it.
Well, it might be common for black people. There's a lot of Michael Browns. There's I don't know. There might be a lot of names that are common in the black community or common in the Hispanic community. That then you're going to be able to say that these are people who are potentially double voting.
Well, yeah, if you could read those. This is Michael, Jill, this says, these are the double names of Michigan. And this is literally just a random segment of their list.
So the double names happen to have different middle names.
Yes, like
so this is really outrageous.
Yes.
This is a violation of the constitutional right to vote.
Let me tell some of the names that these people.
Yeah.
So people who are watching this know this is. I don't know if you can catch that on your camera. Michael James Brown is supposed to be the same voter as Michael Lewis Brown. Michael Bernard Brown is supposed to be the same voter as Michael Anthony Brown. And I don't know if you could catch that. This is from the Michigan list. Now, is this an example here's the question. The Trump campaign would say this is how they're keeping the voter list of Michigan clean of illegal double voters, and would you agree with that or disagree?
I'm concerned. Donald Trump said the election is rigged. I happen to agree with him. He didn't provide any proof, but here we were on the verge of proving him right through the Michigan recount. And then Republicans and his supporters, his lawyers, shut it down. How hypocritical. So the election being rigged is okay as long as it's rigged in your favor? That doesn't sit well with me.
So do you believe that this election was rigged in his favor?
Well, I think he's confused, and it's not the first time. And, you know, he's entitled to his opinions, but not to his own facts. And when he says that there are millions of people who are double voting or who are voting illegally, who are not registered, he does not have facts or evidence to support that. And this is a very good indication of how he is confused. If he thinks that Michael Lewis Brown is the same person as Michael James Brown, he's confused. And the American people should not be duped into believing him for a minute. If he thinks that people are voting 2 and 3 times illegally across borders, he needs to show us the proof, because there is no proof of this to date. And when he says that people that voters are committing fraud by voting too many times, he's got it exactly backwards. What is actually happening here is that people are being denied their constitutional right to vote based on this very abusive system that is just wiping people off the voter rolls. It's the opposite of what he is saying. Not people who are voting fraudulently and illegally, but actually legitimate voters who've had their right to vote taken away from them by Chris Kobach and by Donald Trump. And there is no legitimacy to his claim that there are fraudulent voters that have distorted the outcome of this election.
But then one of the things is, if you were allowed to go ahead with your vote count in Michigan, it's actually kind of counting the votes that haven't been counted yet. But they said around 59% of the precincts are uncountable because, for example, the seals are broken on the machines. So it looks like there's been tampering. So why would you recount the machine if there's been tampering?
So, you know, we need to go into the machines as well. Let's put it this way. We need to examine the machines, and we also need to find out what's going on with these votes. Where there is a discrepancy, we need to actually count the votes and look at where does this discrepancy come from.
Well, that's why he was saying, but the Attorney General ruled that if there's a difference between the number of voters who listed as voting and the number of votes, that there's no sense recounting that precinct. Do you agree?
Well, it should be the
Michigan's
opposite.
law,
It should
and
be
it
the
is
opposite.
true.
Where there
It's
is a
true.
discrepancy, we should count the votes and find out. So, for example, some of the discrepancies are because the polling administrator may have been tired and they recorded it wrong. It may be because a couple votes from a different district got included in this pile. Should that invalidate, you know, the right to a recount for the entire precinct? Of course not. These votes should be recounted. And what it means, if you say that a discrepancy invalidates a recount, you're saying that in communities that are under-resourced, that tend to have these discrepancies because there are exhausted poll workers, because there are too many people voting in that district, and too many ballots that are not being properly accounted for, that these precincts that are under-resourced are the ones that cannot have the validation of their votes. Whereas if you're voting in a wealthy white suburban precinct, no sweat. Your vote will be validated. You can have assurance and confidence in your vote. But if you're African American, these questions cannot be asked.
Well, and by the way, I want to pull back to something we've kind of gotten used to. We have a Republican Secretary of State who's in charge of the voting systems, and a Republican Attorney General who rules on the voting law.
Right.
I also have a European audience, so I'm trying to explain to them that because they don't have partisan officials in charge, they don't have someone from a political party in charge of counting the votes in an election, where it's one official from one party. This is unique to the U.S. So we have Clinton lost 5 of the 6 swing states. The only one that she won officially was in Virginia, Democratic control of the vote count. So do you think that this partisan system is working or not working in America?
Well, we can see how well it's working, exactly,
Well, I mean, it's
which
working
is not
for
very well,
Trump,
right. It is working for the partisans in their states. So yes, this should be a nonpartisan, function. It should not be controlled by cronies of the people who are running for office.
And people running for office themselves. Do you think it's one thing that's held back the Green Party? That we have 50 states, and either Democrat or Republican has control in each state. Has that affected your ability to
put it this way? I think it's hard to believe that it is not an issue for green votes. If it's an issue for Democrats and Republicans suppressing each other, you can be sure that both of them are also suppressing independent candidates. I think one would assume. But this is another reason why, the judge, the federal judge, ruled that I am not an aggrieved party, but actually I am an aggrieved party. All voters are aggrieved parties, and independent candidates are aggrieved parties in this system, and we all deserve to have a credible, reliable vote that we can trust.
Speaking of aggrieved parties, my understanding is that Hillary Clinton said that she would monitor, in some way participate with you. Did you request that she join in? Because she would be from the judge's view, she is the aggrieved party. Was there any attempt, or did she offer to put herself forward as the aggrieved party in the case, or to assist you, or did you reach out to her?
We're not coordinating with Hillary. We're not coordinating with Donald. We invited all of them, as well as Gary Johnson. We really encouraged them to also call for the recount and to support the recount. Our lawyers basically talked to their lawyers, and we encouraged all parties to be a part of this, and heard nothing from them.
So why do you think you heard nothing from Hillary Clinton when the judge basically made an invitation saying, if Hillary Clinton steps forward, the recount goes forward?
Yeah, exactly.
And it was interesting, when we were in the actual recount, there were her observers. We were told that they're observers, that they were not going to challenge. Only the Green Party challengers were going to challenge, and only the Republicans were going to challenge. But Hillary's observers were just going to take notes. And our mouths just dropped. It's like, what? What? I won't say what I was really going to say, but what? Because if they were thinking that the Green Party was going to carry their water, get the recount, and then if we find out, oh wow, Hillary really did win with Michigan, it was going to all be on thanks to Jill. And she get a thank you, but it was going to be her money, her recount, and yet they benefit. And they're not going to say anything. Well, thankfully, not all of them followed their orders. But it was interesting that we were outnumbered so much by Trump challengers that while the recount was going on, the challenging lawyers and everything were making so much noise so that they could actually throw off the count. If you can only count
the Trump lawyers.
The Trump lawyers and their supporters. I mean, I heard one lady say, "Can we hold up while I dump out my purse for a minute?" One of the Trump supporters that was the challenger sitting at the table. And this was all as an obstruction to delay the process, because the whole goal was, you could tell we all had this kind of feeling, we better work pretty fast because we never know when the court's going to make a decision and shut this thing down. So we were going as fast as possible, but there were so many precincts that were just a hot mess that you could not recount them. because the poll book did not match, the tabulation did not match the number of physical ballots in the ballot box. So that wasn't just Detroit, but that was out in the suburbs. Supposedly they have more resources, and they were still a hot mess. But you had those obstructionists who were standing back trying to throw off the count, because we can only count it so many times. So if you count it one time and the number doesn't match then you recount it a second time, and then if that number doesn't match, then we can do it a third time. Well, the distractions are going on. All it has to be is one vote, one number more, one number less, and the whole precinct is unrecountable.
Well, so let me ask you question too, pulling back now to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. It looked like in Wisconsin, well, you did the recount, and in Milwaukee did a fair recount. You got your shot at the recount, and it looks like Trump won Wisconsin. So what's your beef?
Yeah, so it wasn't a real recount in Milwaukee. What they did in Milwaukee was put the ballots back into the same very vulnerable machines, and they got another count, but with the same stuff, every bit as corrupted as it might have been the first time. So this simply, it's like running the rigged Volkswagen emission system, through the exam once again. You're going to get the same rigged result from a rigged Volkswagen that's making the emissions look like they're fine when they're not fine. So this was not a real count, and it was not a real recount. It needed to be a hand recount, which is what the judge had said in Wisconsin, who encouraged all of the precincts to do a hand count. And
he didn't order it, but it didn't happen.
He felt he did not have the legal authority, given their laws the way that they were. He felt like he could not order it, but he encouraged everybody, and then lots of people called in, so that the vast majority actually did hand counts. But where it counted most, in a community of color that was most at risk for having errors and miscalibration, where votes could have been flipped or neglected by a miscalibrated machine, that recount was not done. So the results really need to be taken with a grain of salt, and they cannot be considered a real recount, but rather a study of what could have gone wrong. For example, they found many of these scanners that had modems, and raised all kinds of questions about were the modems being hooked up to something.
Wait, hang on. The scanners, I thought that scanners are not supposed to be connected to the internet.
Yeah.
So they can't.
Yeah.
But they had modems.
So I can't comment authoritatively on this yet, but I'm told that there is a whole laundry list of serious concerns that were documented by the observers in the course of the recount in Wisconsin, and we will be making that public soon.
Well, it looks like they have checkmated you or cornered you in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and not a real recount. So we may be heading towards the Donald Trump inauguration. What do you think that we are?
When we began this recount, we did not have an expectation that we were going to change the outcome here. And the intention was not to change the outcome, but to ask the question, can we be confident in the vote? And that question has been answered with a resounding no. And unfortunately, as you pointed out, if Hillary had been a part of this recount effort, she could have proceeded. This recount would be going forward right now in Michigan. Yes. It would have been unstoppable because she had standing. And this makes the point that the Democrats seem to be more concerned with the smooth transition of power rather than the legitimate transition of power. And I think, it's clear that the American people aren't so interested in the smooth part as they are in the legitimate part.
Here's a question that because I'm always asked this. Why don't the Democrats defend African American votes that have been clearly lost here in Detroit, in Milwaukee,
yes.
In Philadelphia? Is there
Well,
any
one
thoughts?
wonders, is this because the Democrats don't want their primaries investigated? Because in their primaries, there's also a lot of, huge red flags. In Brooklyn, tens of thousands of voters who were purged from the rolls. In California, hundreds of thousands of votes that went uncounted. And, you know, what did this do? It led to the victory of Hillary Clinton, where Bernie Sanders would have won and was expected to have won. So there were real red flags raised about the same concerns in the Democratic primary. So is this, you know, is this a case of the Democrats not wanting to raise issues because they feel like they themselves are culpable? I don't know, but it's clear that this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of just plain basic democracy and of our being able to have a voting system we can trust. Because right now we don't have a voting system we can trust in a society where faith in our social and political institutions is really at rock bottom low. You know, the polls show now that, you know, not only are people disenchanted with the political candidates who led this election, but also with the political parties. Most voters have now divorced both political parties and are members of either they are independents or they're members of small independent parties. And, you know, faith in our economy, faith in our jobs that don't pay adequate wages, faith in the judiciary, in the executive, in Congress, in the media is at rock bottom low. And, you know, it's no wonder that people are standing up and saying, we've got to fight back. We cannot continue to be thrown under the bus. And if we're going to fight on all these other issues where we are being screwed, a generation of young people who are locked in debt, over half of our discretionary budget being spent on these wars for oil that are making us less secure, not more secure, creating failed states and worse terrorist threats. You know, if we're going to have health care we can afford, we have to believe that we have some impact on policy, that our votes have to matter. If we're going to have this bedrock foundation of democracy, then we need to be able to vote and have confidence in our vote. It's not rocket science how to do that. And what we have done in this recount, I think everybody who's been a part of this recount should feel really proud of what you have accomplished. We answered that question that needed to be answered. It wasn't the number that we needed so much as the answer, yes or no. We got a system we can believe in. We do not have a system that we can have confidence in. This is time for us to mobilize, for us to stand up. If you haven't gone to jill2016.com/recount, you know, become a part of it. And let's keep going forward because we've had enough of being thrown under the bus and the clock is ticking. It's time to stand up. Like Alice Walker said, biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We have it, we got to use it.
So one final thing we say to have it to start with. And by the way, this is Greg Palast, and I do not endorse this political commercial that just occurred here. And Greg Palast, Rolling Stone, trying to get some answers out. But people are now figuring the vote failed. The attempt to recount the vote or count the vote failed, or seems to be failing. And it looks like we're heading towards a Trump inauguration. People ask a simple question. What do we do? I mean, you paint a pretty grim picture. Should we just, you know, go to hibernate for what is your advice to people who genuinely are in despair, saying the system's rigged, we can't even vote people out of office anymore?
So what I'd say is remember what Alice Walker said, which I just repeated. Biggest way we give up power is by not knowing we have it. We do have a lot of power here. Remember back, if you are old enough, or if you've read the history books, what did we do under Richard Nixon, one of the most corrupt, oppressive, authoritarian presidents that we've had? What did we accomplish? We brought the troops home from Vietnam. We got women's right to choose from a Supreme Court, which was extremely conservative. We got the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and established the EPA. We also got OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and some degree of protection for workers in the workplace. So we got an awful lot done, and more than that, because we were in a fighting mood. Why were we in a fighting mood? Because our brothers were being sent off to war. They were getting drafted, especially in communities of color, but not only in communities of color. So we were primed for action. We were out in the street and we asserted our power. And Richard Nixon lived in great fear for what we, the people, were going to do democratically as a mass movement out in the street. We need to be out in the street. How did East Germany fall? East Germany fell because people were out marching. They were out marching once a week, and that march got bigger and bigger and bigger until it was such a humiliation to the government that they said to the Army, you know, fire on them. And the Army said, no, there's moms and babies out there. We're not going to fire on them. That was the end of that, of that oppressive administration in East Germany. So do not take the propaganda at face value that they give us that we're absolutely helpless. We need to stand up like the people at Standing Rock stood up and have prevailed to some extent. We need to watchdog that victory and continue to support it. But we have a lot of power when we are mobilized, when we work together, and when we stand up. So that is what this is about us standing together for an agenda that unifies us, not one issue at a time. This is about a joint agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit and with democracy, so that we get to the critical mass we need. So, you know, time to stand up and stand tall and stand together.
So, but given Trump's success, I mean, he's now got both houses of Congress, and it looks like they'll grab the Supreme Court. Are you going to, change your game? Like add a little bling to your style? Start tweeting at 4 a.m. Are you going to do something that'll kind of pick up your game here?
I think the game has everything to do with social media, that's for sure. And the game has everything to do, I think, with throwing off the chains of kind of the old game. The old game was kind of don't really shake things up and kind of stay inside the Democratic Party establishment, which I think has not worked for us. And I think Bernie Sanders' campaign was kind of a watershed moment for how far we can get inside. You can't have a revolutionary campaign and a counter-revolutionary party. And I don't mean to be making this a paid political advertisement, but at the end of the day, this is political. And if we want to get out of here alive, we got to get off of the sinking ship. And, I don't think this is something we have to persuade people of. I think people have already been persuaded.
Yes.
This is about just clarifying for people that we got choices, and we got a place to hang our hats, and we got a place to work together and fight together.
Here's a question. Since the kind of DLC Clinton wing of the party is now demolished and discredited, I believe, or it appears to be, then why don't you take over the Democratic Party? Why fool around for that? I mean, why not? People talk about a third party, but why not have a second party?
Problem
why not
is
move
this:
that way?
how long has this strategy been going on? Take over the Democratic Party and make it good. So as long as I have been, I had my eyes open, that's been the prevailing paradigm. You can go back to the 1960s. We had a big movement called the Realignment Movement, which was about labor and civil rights, that very powerful movement that really changed history, getting together to say, let's change the Democratic Party. And you know what? That effort failed. Why did it fail? Because of the Vietnam War. That if you didn't support the war, then you didn't have the credibility to actually be a critic of the party. So unfortunately, how many countries are we bombing now under Barack Obama? It's like 7 countries that we're bombing now. This war knows no end. The Democratic Party is fundamentally funded by predatory banks, war profiteers, and fossil fuel giants and insurance companies, and the usual. So who's leading the Democratic Party now? Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. How much has actually changed? I'm not sure so much. What about all this soul searching? What about all this, kind of really going back to the drawing boards and rethinking things? This conversation is as censored and limited as it has ever been. As much as there was a blackout on real debate and discussion before the election, there is still a blackout on real debate and discussion within the purview of the Democratic Party and the many nonprofits in the nonprofit industrial complex that are basically in the saddle with the Democrats. That's not where the action is. It's where there's a lot of talk and a lot of effort to rein people in and to kind of sheepdog people back into the Democratic Party and to silence the alternatives. You think there would be some open discussion now. It's not happening inside the Democratic Party.
So I gathered from that you're staying with the Green Party.
I'll tell you, what convinced me to be a Green was when the Democrats killed public financing for political elections. Back in the year 2000 or a little bit before that, they killed the financing. After we passed it, As a referendum, we the people passed it in my home state in Massachusetts. We passed public financing to break the stranglehold of big money, to get the big money out and get the people back in. We passed it by a 2-to-1 margin as a referendum. The Democratic legislature repealed it on a voice vote. That said to me that change is not going to happen inside the Democratic Party. That was back approximately 2000, and I'm sorry to say everything that's happened since has only driven home that conclusion.
Okay, well, thank you
I
for,
have
yeah,
one
go ahead.
question.
Dave?
Sorry, I wanted to follow up something you said
Sure.
earlier I thought was really important, when you said that there was a lack of resources in the communities of color to count the votes in Detroit and Flint. It sounds to me like you're saying that the Republican government of Michigan can't afford to count the votes of people of color.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
they
yes.
can. It's not a matter of ability, it's a matter of willingness. Do you want their votes counted? No. There's something going on in both of these communities. And I mentioned this during the major press conference, that one of the things that happened in Detroit, we opened up precinct 152. And in it, there were 307 ballots supposedly on the poll book, 307 on the tabulation, and yet only 50 physical ballots in the ballot box that's supposed to be sealed. It was properly sealed, but only 50 ballots are in there. Now, what is going on? Is there ballot stuffing? Is there ballot destruction? Is it the machine is hacked? Maybe a combination of all three? We could always say we want the city clerk's head on a platter. We want heads to roll. But after that, the next person coming in there, will they be able to get the resources to be able to run a proper election? Or in 2018, are we going to still be looking at the same problems? In 2020, is it still going to be the same old thing?
Well, the question is, to follow up with Dave's question, is did the Republican state officials squeeze the city of Detroit, squeeze the city of Flint, so that they didn't have the resources, so that there were no resources?
Well, there are many factors contributing to the lack of resources in communities of color. And whether it's the particular budget that they got from the state, whether it's been the extraction of jobs, whether it's been the divestment, the systematic divestment in those economies, these are communities that have become a wasteland of America, a wasteland of democracy and a wasteland of our economies and a wasteland of justice. I think there's nothing new or rocket science about this, and this isn't a matter of a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. This has been going on for a long time, that the African American communities, that communities of color, have been thrown under the bus, including in terms of their right to vote. But what you see clearly happening when 87 optical scanners failed, largely in communities of color in Detroit, that's a pretty clear connection right there, because, why did they fail? They failed because they're old, they're poorly maintained, and then you have high rates of misreading of the votes because of improper calibration. So, it's not rocket science to say that we got a problem with adequate voting infrastructure here. That's not just electronics, it's the other stuff. It's the confusion of the polling places and so on. So, the injustice flows downhill. It always does. And it lands in the African American community.
And at the top of the hill is the state Republican leadership, would you
Yes.
say? Or
At this point, yes, but even before it was the Republican leadership, we've had a problem.
okay, so then we end with my commercial. Seen any good movies lately? if you haven't, I have a copy of The Best Democracy Money Can Buy.
All right.
All right.
For you, so
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
Great.
I hope you had a
Really
chance to
great
take a look.
talking,
Okay,
as
again,
always.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you,
All right.
Dr.
Yeah.
Stein.
All right, Anita.
Thank you. And okay, so forward, this is great information, a lot to take in.
It is, yeah. I mean, did you feel like the end of the recount kind of disrupted your investigation, or were you able to get stuff?
The end of the recount is itself the thing to investigate.
Ah,
for me,
yes.
which
All right.
is
That's great.
the when you first of all, it was a sabotage so that it wasn't recounted.
Yes.
And I think people
That's right.
misunderstand that in effect, when you're saying it's a recount, they imagine, yes, you're looking at the votes that have been counted, but for the most part, it's really a first time counting of votes.
Yes.
Yes.
So that it's all, that's 75,000 votes which were blank
Yeah.
or disqualified. For
Yeah.
example, in our investigation, just so you know, we found recount people who were horrified. A systems analyst who really knows the rules was horrified that when she went in to do recounts, that you have a massive number of people who vote straight party ballot.
Yes.
And if someone votes Democrat straight party ballot, but then
Yes.
writes in Bernie Sanders as a protest, that vote's supposed to actually go to Hillary Clinton. They've made a protest, but in fact, these
Yes.
ballots are being disqualified. So that's what I'm finding is the disqualification of valid ballots,
Wow.
and especially that would be in the inner cities, in Detroit, in
Yes.
Flint. You had people marking optical scanners, but the ballot was supposedly blank for president. People wait to vote for president, and so they're filling it in with pencils or red pens, or they're putting a check instead of filling in the bubble.
When they put a check,
And
yes.
what happens is that the scanner
Can't
reads
read it.
that as no
Yeah.
vote.
It's
Now,
no vote.
there's a great machine called the human eyeball, which can
That's
say
right.
that person voted. So basically, what your request was,
Yeah.
is to count
Count
these
them.
ballots for the
Exactly.
first time that
Yes.
were never
Yes.
counted.
That
A
would
valid
never count.
count.
And that were disqualified from, and then the other is that people in a lot of overvotes I saw,
Yeah.
which means that people supposedly voted for two candidates for president.
Right.
Now I know Detroit schools are bad, but I know that most people in Detroit know that there's one president, you get one choice for president.
And that's true.
And so what happens is I noticed miscalibrations of machines, etc.
Yes.
And so what we're talking about is counting those votes for the first time that were
Yes.
kicked out.
That were kicked
And
out.
I think that's a big misunderstanding because we use the term recount, but it's really counting the uncounted ballots. I saw this in Florida in 2000. I saw it in Ohio in 2004. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And by the way, I don't know how your analysis went, and I know that your money was very limited, but Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Arizona, very suspect counts, all in which Hillary Clinton's exit poll numbers were
Right.
substantial margins,
Yeah.
and miraculously,
Yes.
the final count contradicted the exit polls. These are all states with massive cross-check purges, with massive games with IDs, and of course the recount can't capture people. I see
Yes.
in Michigan
That's right.
very, very few, so few provisional ballots that it's almost impossible. That means that people who are removed from the voter rolls, and there's always someone who has a problem, were not given the option that they should have been under federal law to vote a provisional ballot. So it could be so that in the recount it could be argued. So you couldn't even recount
That's right.
when people are told your name's not here, scram, which is
Yeah.
against federal law.
It's against
Okay.
federal law. But they don't know that.
But they don't know that. A lot of poll workers not being
They don't know
mean.
that
They
either.
don't know that. They've not been trained, and of course that means that the leadership, whether it's coming from the state in the occupied territories, as I think of them, they're not. They know what's going to happen, and they watch it happen. And frankly, I saw this in California, where the Democratic Party leadership saw millions of independent voters about to vote in the Democratic Party, and there was no real training or provision set up to make this happen properly. So literally 1 million votes remain uncounted because of that they allowed the system to fail, and that helped, the candidate of the party. And that's the results of my investigation. That's not a partisan. This is not a partisan statement. This is the reporting of what I
happened.
find.
Yes.
And it's, and like you say, it has the one question I've still been unable to answer in my investigations, which is, why do the Democrats, or why are they silent about the missing votes? And you've posited the theory that they play the same games
They
in
play the same
primaries,
game.
and that will have to that's something we're going to have to look into. And
Yeah.
I think it's what I've seen here is pretty horrific. I don't think people understand. It's not that the recount. What I want, like one of the witnesses, recount witnesses, and this woman was not political. She was impressed by your desire to get all the votes counted. She didn't vote for you. She is not in one. She's an independent. Doesn't favor one party or another. But she wanted to see the votes counted, and she said, "There all those votes." She said, "I know that there were votes that we could have seen, we could have looked at.
Yes.
All we had to do is look at them. We were in the middle of finding lots and lots of votes, and it was stopped.
It was
And
stopped.
they stopped counting the votes that were
Purposefully.
never counted in the first place.
That were
I think
never
people have this idea that the vote's
Yeah.
gonna, there's a flip of a vote from Trump to Hillary or back and forth. That's not the issue. It's
That wasn't
those
the
votes that were never ever
Right.
counted in the
Never
first
counted.
place, and that's not just Michigan, but it's Wisconsin, it's Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And North Carolina is probably, and North Carolina and Ohio, frankly, may be the worst, but I know that your budget doesn't permit moving forward on that. Maybe, do you have suggestions for Hillary? She got extra millions of dollars. What do you think she might do with them? Do you have any advice for, since she's monitoring, maybe she's monitoring this conversation, what would you suggest she do with her money? Seriously, what would you say if she had this money left over? What should she do with it?
You know, I mean, there's a lot she should do with it. But she
Yes.
could start by, supporting voting integrity and supporting the, changes in the structure of voting and in the infrastructure of voting so that we can have a vote we can believe in. And also use it to organize so that we stop these voter ID laws. We need to build movements around all of this. We need a unified movement that includes the many links in the chain that destroys our election system. It's got many pieces and it needs organizing, it needs resources. We need to democratize our elections. And that means not only ending, voter suppression, it means ensuring that we have integrity in the vote. It means having open debates and putting an end to the corporate commission on presidential debates. It means passing ranked choice voting, and it means ending the electoral college and having direct national vote. I don't think there's any way to do this except through an organized movement, and it can't neglect, that people don't have a roof over their heads and jobs. To my mind, this is why we need political parties, because a political party is an agenda that builds critical mass. In the absence of that, we're divided and conquered, and we're never going to get there.
Is it too late for Hillary to ask for the recount in Michigan?
Unfortunately, I think it is,
man.
because you had to have filed for a recount, by specific dates. So she
Okay.
can't do that, but it's, it speaks volumes about, where's the leadership, where's the leadership in the Democratic Party right now? It's not there working for the people, and, it's time to move on.
This is Greg Palast with presidential candidate of the Green Party, Jill Stein, Dr. Jill Stein, and Green Party activist, Anita.
Yes.
Are you a
Bell.
co-chair?
Bell.
Are you a co-chair right now?
No, I'm not. I'm
You're
an
not.
elected
All
officer.
right.
No.
Just-
Anita Bell, Belle.
Yes.
That's a beautiful name. Thank you. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.